Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever people are joining us from, and welcome to this session hosted by ACMI, the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, and with our partners who I'll go into in a moment. This is the second webinar in our series over the last month or two, and this time focused on integrity. And integrity is more than a buzzword. How do we action it? My name is Oliver Glanville. I'm head of programs at the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. Integrity is core of what ACMI is trying to do, but multiple other partners are also evidencing it now, and so we're really lucky to have those joining us on the panel later. Before I give some opening remarks on what ACMI is doing and what the market is looking at here, just briefly some housekeeping. So we will be sort of guiding this session around a panel involving individuals from our partner organizations. So after a few remarks, we'll have half an hour or so of that. Then we really want to open up the floor to significant question and answer session. Certainly off the back of the last webinar, we had huge interest from this, and so we've reacted to that and helped shape in significant number of questions. These will be moderated, but we really encourage you to put them in the chat as we go, and alongside that, during the Q&A session as well, and then we'll wrap up. And just want to point as well, we'll be having another webinar, I think, at the start of October in the run-up to COP as well, and we look forward to those joining that. Now, as I mentioned, integrity is the core of what ACMI is trying to do. Our mission really is just trying to scale high integrity carbon markets in Africa. But the most common question we get, I'm sure many others on the panel get, is what does this actually mean? What does integrity mean? What does it mean to different actors in the market? And we're delighted to have a session involving those from the demand side, supply side, and across the market itself. On ACMI's side, we really don't want to be creating our own integrity standards, but really sharing, such as what we're doing today, what is happening globally in terms of trying to uphold those high integrity standards when it comes to African projects, the use of credits, and the development of enabling environments around that. At the same time as well, we want to be a channel, a vehicle through which we can sort of guide feedback to these emerging integrity standards to ensure that they are representative, if you like, of and appropriate for the African context as well. And as part of that, it's encouraging engagement through webinars such as these and more formal collaboration as well. And then each of our individual programs are guided by some of the integrity standards, which we'll hear a bit more about today. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll now introduce the panel and welcome those to introduce themselves as part of their response to their question. So moderating this panel will be Paul Mathara, the CEO of ACMI, the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. We then have Mark Kemba, Executive Director of VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. We have Lorna Ritchie, Director of Public Affairs for ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and Antoine Demat, Program Director of ICROA and VCM Policy Director at AITA. We're delighted to have these high esteemed individuals join us today with a wealth of experience across the supply side, demand side, as I said, across the whole market. And thank you so much for giving your time today for this webinar. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that, Ollie. And I think it's just such a beautiful luxury for us as ACMI to have truly the entities that live and stand for the integrity principles to help us really try and unpack what does this really mean for the continent. I think sometimes you get a bit of a sentiment that some of the rules are being rolled out to frustrate or put up kind of stumbling blocks to some areas. But we genuinely believe really that the CCPs we're seeing both on the demand and supply side, as well as the spirit being driven by AITA, are really speaking to where we need to go if we really want to unlock maximum value as a continent. So I'll just jump into it, as you've said. And I think, Mark, I will start with you. Um, just going to the basics of what do we actually mean by integrity? And when you look at really the work that BSMI is really hard at work doing, what are the integrity standards you're rolling out? Just so people get and understand that. Please, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to join you this afternoon. I'm delighted to be working closely with ACMI and hope that that collaboration will continue long into the future. I think fundamentally, when we talk about integrity, it's about trust. And we're all focused on carbon markets and potentially perhaps voluntary carbon markets in particular. But this idea of integrity really needs to apply to all forms of investment, of FDI. We know over decades, and I mean, you operating in Africa will know this much better than I do. My experience is more in Latin America, but that ODA, foreign direct investment, investment by other governments, has not always gone where it's most needed, has not always responded to the national strategies or the development strategies, has not always benefited the communities that are most vulnerable and most need the resources. And while we're focusing on carbon markets, in a way, what we're talking about is what should apply to all flows of finance and capital, whether it's north-south, north-north, wherever it may be. The carbon markets we focused on because there are potentially so many areas where it could go fantastically well, but also, as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, where there isn't integrity built in from the outset, it can be almost detrimental to a government, but also to the communities that are hosting projects. And examples of that might be where carbon projects weaken land tenure or land ownership arrangements for local communities or indigenous peoples and so on. But more generally, when we think about integrity, we're talking about trust. Firstly, we want to know that if a project says it is reducing or removing emissions, that beyond reasonable doubt, and I say beyond reasonable doubt because it's never going to be 100% perfect. Nothing is. If everything was 100% certain in life, it would be easy, but it's not like that. So beyond reasonable doubt, that emission reduction and removal is genuinely happening, and that goes beyond what would have happened otherwise. And Lorna will doubtless talk more about that in the context of ICBCM. It's clear it needs to be transparent. Integrity means transparency about who's benefiting. If a company or an individual is paying $20 for a ton of carbon dioxide, who's getting that $20? At the moment, it's very hard to know. And I suspect in ACMI, you will say, well, much of that is going to the middlemen and women or to the financiers, and not enough is going either to the national or local government or the local community that's hosting the project. And we've seen, again, it's not exclusive to carbon markets, but it's very relevant to carbon markets. So who gets the money? Where do the benefits flow? Third, does this really contribute to the host country or host region's national development strategy, or is it just a side gig? And we firmly believe, and I would think that all the others on the panel would agree, that this is one source of finance that needs to be seen as part of the bigger picture of finance and capital needed by countries to meet their net zero targets, to build in adaptation and resilience. That from the user perspective, and this is a good segue into the work that VCMI does, as the audience will be aware, there are concerns that companies have or do use carbon credits as a way of avoiding their responsibilities to cut their own emissions. And so integrity means that carbon credits are used as a complement or a supplement to internal decarbonization efforts, not as a replacement. 20 years ago, it was probably leadership for big corporations to say we're carbon neutral because they offset their head office or some of their operations with carbon credits. Even then, it was sketchy how high integrity that was. But in 2024, that is no longer acceptable, even if it shouldn't have been in the first place. So if I then move on to what VCMI does, we focus on two areas, principally the demand side integrity in the market. And that's where we work closely with and complement the work that ICBCM does, which Lorna will talk about. So we've created a claims code of practice, which is a guidance for companies that want to make voluntary use of carbon credits as part of their broader climate transitions, which shows how they can use carbon credits with integrity. And that means, firstly, meeting a bunch of what we call foundational criteria, which are effectively good practice for companies. Any company that's taking itself seriously on climate change in 2024 needs to know what its carbon footprint is, needs to have targets aligned with meeting global net zero by 2050, needs to be allocating capital to meet those targets. Making a fantastic statement at Davos or wherever it happens to be is not good enough. You've got to allocate capital. Executive pay needs to be linked to meeting those climate targets. So climate becomes a strategic thing, and your lobbying needs to be consistent with net zero. Then you have to demonstrate progress towards those targets. And one of the big things that I hear a lot is companies get a lot of glory for taking on targets and then quietly don't do as much as they should do. So we expect companies to demonstrate they're making progress towards their targets and then use carbon credits to bridge a gap or fill the emissions, cover the emissions that they cannot genuinely reduce at any moment. So you're getting decarbonisation, which is driving technology change along supply chains, but also investment in meeting both global net zero and meeting the needs of host countries. And that links to the other piece of work we do, which is on our access strategies, where we try and work with governments and international organizations to help them think through how does carbon finance fit into that broader finance and investment landscape, or think of it as a country with an investment prospectus for its NDC. What is the role that carbon finance can most effectively play in helping a country meet its net zero development strategy? So that might be leveraging other capital. It might be focusing voluntary carbon projects on technologies or sectors where there isn't yet the capacity or that technology hasn't yet been deployed at scale. It could be building the infrastructure, both human and physical. If you think about the Clean Development Mechanism in India, huge numbers of renewable energy projects. One of perhaps the biggest benefits of that was creating a cohort of people who knew how to do solar project finance, solar maintenance, solar manufacture, grid connection, grid reinforcements, all the basis that you need as a country to be then, as in India's case, have a highly ambitious solar mission. So I think when we look at the access strategies work, it's how does carbon finance play a catalytic role rather than just be another source of probably temporary and fairly low source of revenue. So we focus on the demand side, making sure companies are investing in carbon credits and carbon projects as a complement to go above and beyond to fill gaps when they really cannot reduce their emissions, and that the carbon credits and carbon finance support national sustainable development strategies.
Mark, thank you so very, very much for just how much layers of complexity you've just tried to summarize in that. Deeply appreciated. But if anything, it now makes learners' part that much more complicated. When we now know really the demand side optics around transparency and credibility and revenue deployment and allocation, as well as really building clarity that this is not just offset for maintenance of bad practice. How then do the supply side, the generators of those credits, make sure they're living up to a standard that can catalyze demand for their project, their product? So over to you, Lorna, please.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you so much for inviting me. I was going to say, actually, Mark's introduction makes it much easier for me to explain what the Integrity Council does. But as Mark has set out, where VCMI sets the standard for how you use the credit, the Integrity Council focuses very much on the supply side and how the quality of the programs and the methodologies themselves and how they in turn ensure the integrity of credits. So we work very much in partnership like sister organisations. And like Mark said, the main thing here is about building trust. And we work under the philosophy that where there is an integrity, scale will follow. So it's about building that trust with both governments and organisations that the credits that they're purchasing are representing high integrity. And this is not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of sustainable development and biodiversity, which are also baked into the Integrity Council's core carbon principles. So we assess programs and methodologies against our core carbon principles using the assessment framework. And then only once the programs and their methodologies have been assessed as approved under the framework, can those programs then start issuing core carbon principle labeled credits. So there are 10 core carbon principles. These have been developed with lots of different stakeholders, from market actors, governments, other standards bodies, Global North, Global South. And these also build on discussions that have happened under Article 6 so far, and also the agreed criteria under CORSIA. So we look at various different elements to ensure integrity. So at the program level, we're looking at the governance of the program. What is the program doing to make sure that the right frameworks are in place to robustly apply the CCP label? Are they correctly following procedures? Is there transparency, as Mark mentioned? That's really important core element to ensuring integrity, is making sure that third parties can also see what's going on. And making sure that project and program documents are available. Then we also look at emissions program impact at a program level, sustainable development benefits and safeguards, which is really core to the assessment framework. And then at the methodology level, we look at things like the emissions impact. So are the projects additional, robust quantification? Are they avoiding double counting? And also the procedures in place around sustainable development benefits and safeguards, including things like the contribution to net zero. So is it compatible with the host country's net zero goals?
Thanks so much for that, Lorna. And I'm glad you really flagged the reality that the CCPs already effectively aligned with what's evolved in the Article 6 space, and looking forward to coming back to that point, because we tend to have a lot of questions as to whether the VCM and Article 6 space are in competition or contradictory to each other. So looking forward to your elaboration around that metric. Just jumping over to you, Antoine, just in terms of when you look at the principles that IETA has in place around ensuring the efficient direction of capital towards low and zero carbon emission investments, what exactly does a principle like that really mean when we're talking about the business perspective of allocation? Welcome.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks Mark, thanks Lorna for your remarks. I'm wearing two hats, as you highlighted on your first slide, both as ICRA and IETA, although they're the same organization. So I'm going to try and tell you the work we're doing on high integrity in both organizations. So just to clarify first how the two interact. So IETA is a large industry association for high integrity carbon markets, promoting and trying to advance the role of carbon markets globally, with 350 members. So it's a broad church. You have large emitters from energy industry who are exposed to compliance markets, but also actors in the VCM. And then you have the broader carbon market ecosystem. So the project developers, the lawyers, the carbon crediting program, the rating agencies, the insurance companies, all the brokers, traders are in it as well. So we're trying to define integrity, bearing in mind that all of these people are participating when we develop position papers. And IETA has been around for 25 years now, for quite some time. ICRA was formed back in 2008, is now fully part of IETA since 2011, and we're very much focused on the promoting integrity in the VCM at the service provider level. So it very much complements the work that VCMI and ICVCM do on the demand side and supply side. We have 30 accredited organizations today, and we also provide an endorsement of crediting programs, which will evolve in the future in light of the work that ICVCM is doing in this space. So I'm going to first start with ICRA. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just cover briefly what the ICRA accreditation for service providers is. It's based on a document that is central to ICRA called the ICRA Code of Best Practice, which cuts across the mitigation hierarchy. So there are 3 sections that cover footprinting services, advisory services to how to design and implement a science-based, science-aligned decarbonization strategy, and then how to credibly use carbon credits as part of it. So it's not trying to reinvent the wheel where internationally recognized standards already exist. It's just a way to aggregate all of that information in one document. And then we run a third-party audit of all the accrediting organization annually to ensure compliance with the ACRA code of best practice. And then you can use the ACRA accredited label, which you can see on top of this slide. So the goal here is, back in 2008, when nobody was doing this, is self-regulation for the VCM. So the same thing as Mark and Lorna said, we want to build trust in the market. So the mission very much is alive today. And what we're looking at is expanding both in terms of relevance to new types of service providers in the market. You have a lot of new players who are not, you just don't know they're following best practice in the space. And then we also want to expand in terms of coverage, new areas, expanding the code into new areas, such as, good governance seems really key in light of what you've seen in the media lately concerning some activities from service providers. So I'll keep it at that on what we do at ACRA, but it very much complements the work of ICVCM and VCMI. So it's great to see Mark and Lorna's work. Then moving on to the next slide, from an AITA point of view, earlier this year, AITA developed and published guidelines for high integrity use of carbon credits. So this came from the broader AITA membership. And the idea was that there were a few concerns around, well, the pace of Paris delivery, that's the overall concern, but also the challenges that corporates face when it comes to using markets to play their part, to be more ambitious. We also, so AITA commissioned research from allied offsets that show that globally 80% of the largest companies do not yet have a target, which is really concerning. A lot of the targets are missed, especially when it comes to scope 3, just highlighting how difficult it is. And then the hard to abate sectors who are well represented in AITA just have the greatest challenge to deliver at a pace that is aligned with the Paris Agreement. So AITA created a task force on, how do we raise ambition for corporate net zero delivery? And then what is the high integrity use case for credits for all of your unabated emissions? So how do we help companies stay on track? And what is the role of the market in that? So AITA developed 6 guidelines, and they're highlighted here. You can access the document on the AITA website if you use the QR code on this page. So you need to first demonstrate support for the Paris Agreement goals, and then quantify, publicly disclose your scopes 1, 2, 3 emissions profile. That is, in line with internationally recognized standards like GHG Protocol, ISO 14064, and so on. Disclose them regularly, have them third-party verified. Guideline 3, establish a net zero decarbonization pathway and near-term targets. So we recognize there that there are sectoral differences. Not everybody's equal when it comes to this. AITA itself does not define how to establish a net zero pathway. And then for interim net zero, interim targets, we just simply defer to, those various options that exist, like SBTI, Transition Pathway Initiative, Mission Possible Partnership, and others. And then we just encourage all companies to join larger initiatives like the Race to Zero, the Women Business Coalition, the Climate Pledge, just to mention a few. And then 4, which is quite central to the document, and we welcome questions on this one, is that, credits, as Mark and Lorna said, need to be used in line with the mitigation hierarchy, measure, reduce, avoid, use credits for the remaining emissions. In the guidelines, they are to be applied across all scopes 1, 2, and 3. And then where there is clearly a risk of missing, or where a company misses an interim target, we feel there's just no excuse, and a company should be using carbon markets, a readily available tool, to bridge the gap there. So on a ton-for-ton basis. Guideline 5, ensure that only high quality credits are used. So this goes back to the work that ICVCM does, of course, as it's rolling out its first decisions at the moment. We encourage all companies to do their own due diligence and consider CORSIA and ACRA credits as well as part of the strategy, and to use both removals and emission reductions, both needed where we are now. And then finally, guideline 6, disclose the use of credits. So if you're missing, your target, you clearly have to substantiate why that is the case, and just disclose the quantities and all the details around the use of your credits. We need as much transparency as possible for this market to build trust. So that's, in a nutshell, the work that ACRA and AITA are doing at the moment on integrity. And thanks again. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that detail, Antoine. Really, it really puts in a bit of context, the conversation we really need to have. And Mark, just giving you a heads up, I will be coming to you kind of putting you in the hot seat around the scope 3 versus SBTI current situation, but we'll come back to that. Lorna,
Paul, can I, before you
Yes.
put me on the hot spot, hot seat, can I make a quick comment?
Please do.
I think one of the things that runs across what all three of us have said is, and I think Lorna put it best, that integrity is the basis of trust. And without trust, we're not going to get a market that gets to scale. It'll always be subjected to criticisms, legitimate or otherwise, from outside, and we won't get that sort of scale that we're thinking of, $50 to $100 billion a year, potentially within 5 to 10 years. Integrity, some have accused us collectively of, as you, I think, mentioned in your opening remarks, that integrity is just people putting up barriers to flows of finance. And I just wanted to address that point head on. We have seen that whether it's in the CDM or whether it's in the voluntary market to date, there have been questions about integrity, and that the questions about integrity and the particularly lack of integrity have been the reason, probably the biggest reason, that the market hasn't grown to its potential and that the finance isn't flowing. Lack of integrity on the demand side, how companies have used carbon credits, has meant that companies now are in a position where it's cheaper to do nothing than to take action and be accused of doing the wrong thing. Capital is not flowing into carbon projects because nobody wants to be the next project that is exposed in a TV documentary. So we are absolutely focused on integrity as an enabler of high quality scale, not as a barrier. And I think that's true of all three of our organizations. I mean, Lorna and Antoine can speak for their own, but we see this as the basis. Now, it can be painful to start with. It means that some projects and some activities and some companies' use cases may not pass the test. And obviously that causes problems. But if we don't have that integrity and hence the trust, the market will never scale. And we'll be still talking about something that's less than $1 billion a year that doesn't deliver the sustainable development benefits that we know it can do.
Thank you so much for putting that simple reality on the table, Mark. But maybe just coming back to you, Lorna, that as we go through this discussion, we keep seeing that there are effectively 3 segments of these carbon markets. You have the voluntary side, you have the Article 6, and compliance. And as we talk about scaling the carbon markets, how do we build an understanding that these are not, as it were, competing, conflicting pillars as we grow them together? Please, Lorna.
Thanks, Paul. And I think what you're saying there is right. They're not competing. Both voluntary and compliance are needed. We need all the tools available in order to decarbonise as fast as possible. And ICVCM and Article 6 and UNFCCC are necessary in order to ensure high integrity carbon markets. Otherwise, we're just not going to meet net zero targets. And there are a number of benefits of both ICVCM and Article 6 working hand in hand. So, for example, at the moment, there's no plans for Article 6 mechanism or UNFCCC to oversee the integrity of the voluntary market. This is not something that countries are looking like they will agree to do. And so the Integrity Council provides that oversight. And once 6.4 has been agreed, there still remains a need for assurance and oversight of the voluntary market. Also under 6.2, so for those that aren't familiar, I'm sorry for using so much jargon, but basically Article 6 is the carbon markets discussion under the UNFCCC, and it's split into two parts, cooperative approaches under 6.2, and then the 6.4 carbon market mechanism, which replaces the CDM. So under 6.2, there's also the flexibility that countries have to use existing voluntary carbon market programs and infrastructure. So, for example, Singapore has decided that they're going to use Vera and Gold Standard programs to source their credits. And again, Integrity Council can support countries ensuring that those programs and the methodologies that they're using are high integrity. It means that countries, if they wish, can use core carbon principle aligned credits. And additionally, voluntary carbon markets can help countries that are looking to get into compliance markets or Article 6 later on to develop that high integrity infrastructure and engage in Article 6 in the future. So I mentioned earlier, but the ICVCM's core carbon principles, they build on those agreed under CORSIA. We're working very closely with the UNFCCC and parties to align emerging discussions that are happening under Article 6 with our core carbon principles and vice versa, so that we can support countries and project developers to be kind of Article 6 ready. But there always remains a need, while we have a voluntary and a compliance market, to make sure that there is oversight and make sure that these have standards in place to ensure integrity.
Thank you so much for that, Lorna. And if anything, I think really just the layers of detail and complexity, I think strong encouragement to all to reach out to the websites and these speakers for more detail and data around the points being made, because there's only so much you can summarize in this. But thank you so much for that scoping, Lorna. But back to you, Mark. Some people would say, why are you even having a webinar discussing credits when SBTI given such almost adverse messaging around where they should fit in the overall ecosystem? Please, Mark.
So, I mean, Paul, you've put your finger on the hot button issue of the day, which is when and under what circumstances can companies credibly make voluntary use of carbon credits? And, you know, I think I made it clear in my opening remarks, that is why VCMI exists. And we believe that the claims code, and I'll come to the scope 3 piece in a minute, is a high integrity, credible way of doing that. Now, I mean, I don't think there's any dispute between any of the target setters and those of us on the carbon market side when companies use carbon credits to go above and beyond their targets. But let's not forget that most companies, whether it's under SBTI or another target setting arrangement, their targets for 2030 in most cases. So those standards say nothing about what companies do between now and 2030 and between 2030 and their next targets. As Lorna said, we need every tool in the box if we're going to meet the Paris goals. And that means companies taking responsibility for their emissions in 2024, 25, 26, 27, and so on and so forth. And so firstly, we would say that a company should be combining decarbonisation and carbon credit use every single year. Carbon emissions should be seen as a liability on a company's balance sheet or on its books, and it needs to take responsibility for it, because every emission every year contributes to loss and damage somewhere on the planet, and usually not where that company is, but in some vulnerable community somewhere. So firstly, it's a focus on taking action now, and that is separate from what the target setting programs do. When it comes to the target year, those target setting programs will also support, and SBTI put in their Beyond Value Chain Mitigation report, support work like VCMIs to encourage companies to make claims about having met their targets and going above and beyond. Now, where the controversy is whether or not, and if so, how companies can use carbon credits as part of meeting their targets or their climate transitions. And we've argued, and Antoine mentioned some of this data, and similar to data that we have found, that of the companies that have science-based targets initiative, and let's remember, these are companies that are self-defined leaders. There are 5, 6, 7,000 of them, of the 100,000 large listed companies in the world, of the 330,000 large companies and the 330 million companies around the world. We're talking about 6 or 7,000 who have science-based targets. And around 2/3 of those will not and are not on track to meet their Scope 3 targets. Most of them are making some progress on Scopes 1 and 2, so that's their own operational emissions, but on their value chain, both supply chain and use and disposal of their products, very few are making significant progress. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we go, that's a shame? Or do we say, no, that's not good enough? Companies need to take responsibility for those emissions, and there may be insurmountable hurdles in the short term. Technology may not be available, costs may be too high, capital may not be available to get on track immediately to meet those targets through their own efforts. But they should then, and you could say there's a choice, either pay whatever the social cost of carbon is into the loss and damage fund, because every excess emission is causing loss and damage somewhere, or take responsibility for those emissions by buying high integrity carbon credits that are certified under the core carbon principles. And we would say, we're not saying that to a company, therefore you have met your target. No, you have to report your own efforts and the use of carbon credits separately. But carbon credits, if they're high integrity, which is what the ICBCM ensures they are a legitimate way to reduce and remove emissions. And therefore we should be encouraging companies to do that. So we launched last week a public consultation, or what we called our Scope 3 claim, which is a way for companies to demonstrate that they're making meaningful progress. They're really taking action, and they're buying carbon credits where there are barriers to them being on track to meeting their Scope 3 targets. And as I've said, nearly 2/3 are off track. So that's a pretty big bunch of companies who we're asking to take responsibility. And that responsibility means channeling finance through high integrity carbon markets and boosting the demand, which after all is what the market is lacking at the moment. So firstly, I'd just say to all those on the panel, please, on the call, please respond to our consultation. It's on the VCMI website. This is a debate that is going to run and run. I can't speak for SBTi. I don't know where they're going to land, but we firmly believe that if a company is on track with its Scope 1 and 2 emissions, it's already in a leadership group. If it is then making meaningful progress on Scope 3 and doing everything it can, and then buys carbon credits, that is not greenwashing. That is not misleading. That is not evading responsibility. That's stepping up and taking responsibility, and therefore it should be rewarded, recommended, and adopted.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. I have a very unfair question. You won't have to answer. Even when you talk about just kind of the stepping up to take responsibility, will there need to be a point at which we get into assessment of whether credits need to be acquired from the areas who are mostly adversely affected by the climate change realities we're going to? But that's much, much, much broader than the focus of this session. So I just maybe, before we go into Q&A, ask the panelists with what we've spoken about in terms of the CCPs on both the demand and supply side, as well as the guidelines rolled out by IETA. Why don't we just say we've done the work? What still needs to be done, really, so we make sure that we can really better address integrity across the ecosystem of the conversation we're having? Start with you, Lorna, and then Antoine, and then we'll close out with Mark. Thanks.
A lot of work that still needs to be done, although we are we've made significant progress in recent years. So the Integrity Council, we have started our assessment process. We've already approved 5 programs as CCP aligned, and we have approved a number of methodologies in the landfill gas and ODS destruction categories. but we intend to strengthen and improve and build on the core carbon principles over time. And there's a number of areas that we've already identified where there's further work that is needed. So we have pulled together expert groups in order to do this. So although we made significant step forwards in the last assessment framework, there is still a lot of work in the space that needs to be done to refine and develop standards. And particularly one area is around benefit sharing. So how can we make sure that there's transparency between programs and the communities that they're hosting their projects in? You mentioned Article 6. So what does a corresponding adjustment mean for the voluntary carbon market? How do we take that into consideration? And Mark, you mentioned loss and damage and adaptation. So there's another question about, so this is a very live discussion under Article 6, like how should carbon credit projects contribute towards climate adaptation? There's a share of proceeds that's required under Article 6. Maybe that's something that the voluntary carbon market should consider as well. How do we align carbon projects with the host country ambition? There's so many areas where further work is needed. I could go on, but I think it's really important that we continue to work together. Lots of different organisations coming together. We build on the discussions that are happening under Article 6, and we also bring in market actors and programmes as well to this discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Lorna. Just before I go across to Antoine, really just audience, you can see there's so much to share and so many layers of clarity. If you let us keep going on, we will fill this out. So we really look forward to seeing some of your questions coming through in the Q&A, so we can reorient and just make sure we're addressing what are your fundamental questions that have not been answered with the credible and quality points made so far. But back to you, Antoine. What still needs doing? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think just all very, very valuable points mentioned by Lorna just now. So just to say something a little different, and that really is important from an AIDA standpoint, it's all the capacity building that we just need to do to make sure everybody understands how they can benefit from markets. In the African context, I think that means there needs to be a lot more interaction between the private sector and government. So AITA, conducts. We're very happy to work with ACMI on this in the future. Workshops where we invite NGOs, governments, private sector, just so that they can talk, because there's just so much confusion, generally speaking, on the role that markets can play, so that governments understand how private sector finance can help them deliver their NDCs and increase ambition under their NDCs, and then so that they, in return, can provide clarity and create a conducive environment for the private sector to invest with a long-term view and just certainty, confidence around where the finance is going. So I think that's the critical part that I would add. And there's just so much work to be done in this space, and the VCM really acts as this sort of pilot market that hopefully leads to better implementation of Article 6.
Thank you so much for that, Antoine. I think if anything, it's just absolute credit to our panelists that we're not being drowned in these questions because of the quality, clarity of the points you're conveying. But as we close out with you, Mark, just a further ask to the audience, please put together your questions just to make sure that we are responding. I know as we're opening, Oliver told you there will be a follow-up, but there will never be enough webinars to answer all the questions that need to be answered. So really look forward to seeing your questions, and we can move from there. Mark, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. So first, I'd like to echo what Lorna said, and I think that you put it under the banner of transparency. We need to have much more transparency and openness about what happens in the market if we're going to dispel the mistrust and distrust that there is, and demonstrate that integrity is the route to scale. And that means transparency, on benefit sharing, but where the money goes, who gets the money, how the projects are working, how they've been designed. Is free and prior informed consent just a buzzword that someone ticks, or is that something that is central to project development? How are companies making decisions, and so on and so forth? So transparency on that. This is, after all, let's not forget, this is a public purpose market. It only exists to deliver climate mitigation, and sustainable development. And so one could have a principle that every piece of information about every project and every transaction should be in the public domain unless there is a public purpose reason for it not to be. And a public purpose might be, you've got a community who, if people know that they're suddenly getting revenue from a carbon project, they might be attacked, or they might be, whatever, something bad could happen. And we've seen this in some cases. So you could think of some public purpose cases where you might want to keep the identity of people confidential. But overall, there should be a basic premise that everything should be transparent. It's the only way we can show that integrity is being applied and what it means in practice. And that links to having evidence. And I think, you mentioned the debate about how and when carbon credits are used, but also a broader debate about the quality or otherwise of carbon credits. We need to build a body of evidence that shows when carbon finance is the most effective way of achieving an outcome and when it isn't. And I think we've fallen into a trap of a debate where it's carbon finance will solve all the world's problems, or carbon finance is an unmitigated disaster. The truth is somewhere in between. There are some cases where carbon finance is absolutely the catalyst needed. There's no other way to finance an activity or a technology. In other cases where it may not be the right thing, and some evidence to underpin that. There are cases where companies may be using carbon credits just to avoid taking responsibility and they don't invest. But in other cases, they're really using it to set an internal price of carbon, to drive new technologies up and down their supply chains. So I think we need transparency, we need evidence. Then, of course, and it echoes a little bit what Antoine was saying, we need capacity building. And this is, Paul, where ACMI plays such a huge role, that the project developers, the verifiers, the validators, the adjudicators are not all based in the global north, where they have traditionally been and where they are expensive. So building up the local capacity to be able to respond to local needs and ensure that a lot of the money and the capacity stays in the region where the projects are taking place. And then, of course, the elephant in all our rooms, which is demand. It's all very well having lots of projects and lots of high integrity standards, but if no one is going to buy this stuff, then we're kidding no one but ourselves. And so that's where, and it goes back to this point about the Scope 3 claim, but it's making the case that this is a legitimate way, when done with high integrity, to channel climate finance where it's needed most, to avoid, I think what we sometimes call stranded opportunities, where there are investments that need to take place that are not necessarily the lowest cost or that face barriers and need this carbon finance to overcome them. That's what makes them additional. But if we say, wait for 5 years until our governments get our acts together to pay for them, then they'll go. And imagine a community that has the choice between a diesel genset to generate electricity and an off-grid solar system, and the off-grid solar system may be more expensive, saying to that community, no, you can do without electricity for 3 or 4 more years until we get public finance. That's not fair, it's not moral, it's not good for the planet. So let's think about, how do we drive the demand so we don't have stranded opportunities, so we don't embed fossil fuel infrastructure. And that means us all collectively saying, there is a valid role for this, and these are the circumstances, and we encourage this investment. And that's governments from north and south, investors, and broader stakeholders.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. Maybe just Mariama, just to go to your question, you queried what steps are being taken to ensure transparency and accountability in credits being traded through the ACMI platform. Just to affirm, ACMI will not be running any platform, but what we are doing is convening all the ecosystem players so that when you talk about trading of these credits and emissions, we can then make sure it's aligning appropriately with some of the standards being rolled out and guidelines being provided by IETA. And I maybe just, Antoine, you'll be able to just contextualize that when we have this deliberation as to really who should be the arbiter of when you use an offset. Is it a regulator? Is it a consumer? Is it the financier or someone else? I don't know whether across the panelists you have a view on what steps will be taken. I think undoubtedly we're trying to work with governments to put in place as clear a policy and regulatory framework of how the market should work. But pending that, very much to Mark's comment, are we saying do not do anything until that clarity is there, or is there intermediate kind of intervening steps that can be taken? Maybe start with you, Anton.
Very important question. I think, no one needs to wait. I think there's just a lot of guidance already out there. Please use the guidance frameworks from the two initiatives we have on the panel today. There's no need to wait, but yes, governments are increasingly stepping in. Some of them will not have a clear role in defining additional rules, and instead will recognize the roles of ICVCM and BCMI, for instance, like the US government announcement that we saw earlier this year. Lorna mentioned Singapore, taking steps as well. So I think increasingly we'll see, more rules in the VCM, but it's a voluntary market, and hopefully those benchmarks will come from large global initiatives like the BCMI and ICVCM. That's how it should be. But the VCM, normally wouldn't exist if we were all on track. So we just need to see governments really stepping in and really doing their work, because the VCM is not going to deliver the Paris agreements. It's the governments who need to do their work as well.
No, thanks for that, Antoine. And maybe just jumping across to you, Lorna. Especially when we talk about carbon markets on the African continent, especially when in the context of nature-based, there are a lot of kind of accusations that this is simply neocolonialism. So as we're rolling out the standards and integrity requirements on the supply side, what is being built in to really address and unpack that accusation? Welcome, Lorna.
Thanks, Paul. I think that's something that both Lorna and I probably have an opinion on, but I think some of those accusations are legitimate. And the reason I say that is because we have seen projects in the past, and I'm delighted that ICVCM is addressing this head on. We've seen projects where communities have been asked or required to give up their land rights or give up their access rights to resources, including carbon. And not only that, in exchange for prices that are very low and a share of the revenue stream that is vanishingly small that these communities receive. So here is a community that has an asset, and it's no different from, terms of trade issues, colonial issues, in terms of what is a fair price, what is a fair transaction. So I think, I think those concerns are quite legitimate, but I think through transparency, through the work of the ICVCM and others, we can address that. We need to have higher prices. That's going to be driven by demand. We need to have transparency, as many of us have already said, about where the money goes. And it probably means, and I think we've seen this already in Kenya, Paul, you'll know more than I do, but in some countries where governments have said, look, we're not going to tell you what the voluntary carbon market needs to look like, but there's a tax and there's a minimum amount that needs to go to the local community. And I think more and more, it'll be interesting, Lorna, you can talk about the Indigenous People and Local Communities Forum, which is one way of making sure communities are invested from the outset and defining what the projects do. So I think if we think about this, move towards thinking more about this as partnerships than about a transaction where I extract the maximum rent I possibly can, as we've done for years and years and years, then I think if we shift the way we think about this with integrity at the heart, with transparency at the heart, then I think we won't overcome all those accusations, but we can deal with them much better. If not, yes, it's just the global South subsidizing the global North again, and all our integrity initiatives are at least in part designed to avoid that.
Yes, so as Mark has said, I think it's been a real challenge in the carbon market before. So my background before moving to the Integrity Council, I worked for the UK government, and it was a real issue under the CDM. There was lots of issues around land grabs, and this is where the Integrity Council that's why it's such a core part of the continuous improvement work programme that we're doing. It's around transparency, making sure that there is benefit sharing with local communities. As Mark has said, the Integrity Council, but also carbon markets more broadly, are moving into the space where it's more about, like under Article 6, it's a cooperative approach, it's a partnership. It's involves the local community, the host country is involved, they're aware of the projects that are happening within their country, how they can support both development, nature, biodiversity, and also their NDC, and it's part of an overall strategy. It's not just a third-party company coming in and creating credits to then sell on without any benefit being seen by the country itself. So we're moving into a different and much more positive space, and the Integrity Council and the work under Article 6 is helping to move it in that direction.
Thanks for that context, Lorna. And I think it really re-emphasizes the fundamental point that with a lot of the work that ACMI is trying to do on the project developer side is how do we address capacity building to make sure that projects are not only being driven by global north people coming into this space, but actually building capacity of local project developers to really understand, contextualize, and execute what is possible in their space. But I think a core pillar of that is how we're going to make meaningful capital actually get released to allow projects to roll out. Because one of the big challenges being faced is with the delay being seen on the validation verification process, as well as the pricing challenges with credits that you need project developers with a lot of upfront capital to do anything. So how do we change that dynamic, that reality? I don't know, Antoine, whether that is any of the components being looked at in the IATA guidelines, and maybe Mark, you can just add your voice and perspective around that as we kind of run down to the last about 4 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Could you please, paraphrase and indicate again which point you think in the guideline might address it?
It was a potentially unfair question as to whether there's any element in the guidelines that's really looking at how to unpack the when you look at tradability, the factors around local participation, local ownership of that direction, and the capacity building necessary to make sure there can be that level of ownership. Thanks.
Thanks for clarifying. No, the guidelines don't go into that level of detail. They're much higher level than this. It's really critical, though. Just transition is mentioned in the document, but it doesn't include any guidance on the topic.
Sorry for the hard question. Mark, just over to you, maybe just some perspective thoughts.
Well, I mean, as Lorna's already mentioned, in the case of the ICBCM assessment frameworks, there are criteria which are, continually being developed at the moment around benefit sharing, but also around alignment with net zero, and there will be some work on just transitions. In the case of BCMI, in our claims code, we don't deal with that specifically, but in the work that we're developing around access strategies, thinking about helping governments and others think about how to engage strategically with the market, part of that is involving all stakeholders and looking at benefits beyond the direct sale of carbon credits. And I think that's work that still needs to be done. I'm not sure that all the capacity building initiatives, ACMI is certainly looking at this, but some of the bigger, more traditional capacity building initiatives don't necessarily focus on that. And I think that's somewhere it goes to the question about, the question about neocolonialism, about the questions of integrity as an enabler rather than a barrier. If we don't address those issues, then we're not going to solve the problem.
Thanks so much for that, Mark. Maybe just as we close out, could I give each of you just 1 minute to give any closing perspective and insights? We'll just start with you, Lorna, and then Antoine, and then close out with Mark. Thanks all so much.
Thanks, everyone. And I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and particularly it's good to get some questions and hear about what concerns people are thinking and front of mind. But I mean, the main thing that's come out of this discussion in my mind is around the importance of transparency and the work that we need to do there. And it covers just so many different areas. More transparency can help with community benefits, but it also helps with integrity. So making sure that third parties can check and see that projects and programs are high integrity. And I think that's a really common thread through a lot of discussions at the moment, is the importance of transparency. And so it's interesting that this has come out of this discussion as well.
And I would absolutely echo that. Unsurprisingly, I think transparency is absolutely key. But I think it's incumbent, I mean, on all of us, and I don't just talk about the panel, but those of us listening on the webinar who are involved with carbon projects, let's provide evidence, not soft soap, but real evidence of where companies have used carbon credits with integrity, both on the supply and the demand side, because there are stories, and many of them will be true, about poor use of poor quality credits. So when we can't just pretend that's not the case, let's show how it's done well. And there are examples of that. And through ACMI, there will be many more examples of that, so that we can make that case, but also understand the limitations. So we're being honest. Integrity means honesty. So if we can be transparent and honest about how it works, when it works, and what makes the projects work better, then we'll be doing the world a service.
Well, I think what isn't in guidelines, but it's part of the work that we do at ACRA, there's just a lot of areas that we're planning to include going forward, including good governance, to address some of the very, negative stories that you've seen in the media lately. So we really want to make sure that all of these service providers we provide accreditation for. So I'm talking about the developers, the brokers, the intermediaries, all of these people who we criticize often for, not being transparent, being opaque, not sharing much about how much money they're making and so on, to make sure we have more criteria for them around good governance. I don't know if that we'll be able to cover, benefit sharing in these areas. So looking forward as well to the work that ISCVCM will do in this space. But that's an area where we can make sure there's a lot more transparency, which isn't the case at the moment.
With that, just mine is just to deeply appreciate our panelists for the depth and just scope of knowledge they shared during this tight 1 hour. Mark, Lorna, Antoine, thank you all so very, very much. And just for us, to the audience who were so proactive, although we drowned you in a great deal of information, that the hard questions were posed. And I think we, as ACMI, will see to what extent we can elaborate what was able to be shared in this session to come back to you on emails. But thank you all so very much for the time you've given to this. And as Oliver highlighted, we will be scheduling a follow-up, and we'll see the extent to which we can really start unpacking some of the challenging questions raised around pricing and sustainable transparency. But thank you all very, very much for this time, and look forward to engaging you once again as ACMI. Thank you.